Establish and designate professional technical departments. That is, CDE, industrial centers, etc., which have the right to see it. CDE. Therefore, this information will be more fully disclosed to relevant parties and regulators, which is a matter of expertise. Structure. The last part is inspections by overseas pharmaceutical institutions. Inspections by overseas pharmaceutical institutions themselves do disclose certain to regulators, for example. We have always said that if foreign visitors come to China to inspect Chinese pharmaceutical factories, it is necessary to coordinate with Chinese regulators. And the provincial bureau in our province would send observers. How many will there be each year? There was a statistical report on the former industrial center. Now, they require a special list not only for being inspected. Moreover, the specific circumstances being inspected are actually more disclosed than before. Besides these three blues, we find more information that we previously did not consult regulators. Fong has disclosed it. For example, through consignment sales, and then a product including traditional Chinese medicine. Its domestic sales, its export sales. The quantity of its production and import, as well as the countries to which it is exported after accepting production commissions from abroad. Export production volume, delivery volume, and so on. This information was previously not disclosed, including what we call overseas commissioning, which used to be without regulations, will require filing with the provincial bureau. However, in 2020, when we streamlined administrative licensing items, we did strip them down. 2020. So after 2020, we actually don't need to report to the provincial bureau. 2020. Now we will find all these pink areas. These are all new items we need to report to regulators. All of this is, to some extent, trade secrets. This actually requires not only regulators but also confidentiality mechanisms in place. This includes corresponding management within the enterprise. Because if you complete an annual report, won't more people get involved? More people go to a team, or even external company outsiders for years. Reported. This aspect actually needs to be managed. Besides more trade secrets requiring careful consideration. Even if necessary, relevant parts of the company should establish corresponding regulations. There's one more thing to consider, which is still a question many people have in discussions nowadays. It's about who is responsible, who is the one to sign. In fact, it's a simple sentence. First, the top leader signs off and takes responsibility. The annual report management regulations were clearly stated when we introduced them in April. It is the legal representative of the enterprise or the person in charge of the enterprise. But in this place, if it's an imported medicine, for so-called overseas produced drugs, the signatory should be his agent within China. The legal representative or head of the enterprise representing him domestically is the legal representative. Sign. The legal representative is very simple. The legal representative is a standard for determining the legal representative. That is, whoever is listed on the business license must be the legal representative. However, this often happens. Sometimes a legal representative may hold multiple properties. The company, or in some cases, the legal representative is merely a customer. What we call toolmen. In fact, the person in charge of the enterprise running the business or another person. The company leader is not listed on the business license, but the person in charge will be part of our ecosystem. Su Cho can prove the items listed above. In another case, the legal representative. When the company leader is still uncertain about making a judgment, we will wait and pay attention to last month's implementation regulations of the Fishing Products Management Law. Seeking a bit about women's colleges, specifically to clarify what a principal person in charge is. What is the relationship between the main person in charge and the company leader? But from here, he will be a valuable lesson. He specifically identified the one who actually controls the company, which is fully responsible for the company's operations and management. People. If you say it's just a shell, or repeatedly transferring your holdings. If you want to escape and hide these people, you can't really hide them. He was now trying to find the actual controller. If you treat the actual controller as an empty shell. If it's the legal entity, then according to this law, we will dig for its main person in charge. Therefore, our United Daily News regulations are very clear. They must arrest the actual top leader. The top leader must sign off to take responsibility. Here it might be said, but he wrote one or a written authorizer. Written authorization, you just authorize them to sign for you. However, the legal responsibility for this signing representative still lies with the legal representative or the head of the enterprise. Responsibility. You can't shirk your responsibility. When responsibility cannot be shirked, is it really okay to entrust others to sign? Or rather, your company doesn't have a complete system to control risk. Controlling the overall quality of the Lianbao newspaper, then authorizing another person to sign. But if you take responsibility for harming yourself, there are actually problems. So, regarding the reporting management regulations for this year, in which they were formulated. And I think the regulators have always insisted on one thing. It means punishing people, and punishing the top leader. This is a distinctive feature of our China United Daily News. Now that we've covered the features of the Lianbao, we can start preparing. I believe it's been almost 2 months since the Lianbao was published, more than a month. The entire regulatory template, along with the instructions it fills out. All companies that are preparing should have already begun preparation. At least start preparing, I think that's a good thing. This shows that these companies have products listed no matter what. Because only when a product is launched will it be listed and reported in the future. When preparing, you will face some issues right from the start. When reading the regulations. Especially some issues, I originally thought it might be. Everyone should know. But recently, some discussions made me realize that some issues are really not known to everyone. For example, the most typical first question, which varieties should our United Daily Report cover? If I was approved in 2021, do I need to apply this year? 2021? Even though the regulations in the United Daily News clearly state it. For drugs approved for market launch in the current year, holders may submit the annual report information. Consolidated into next year's report. Even though you've written like this, I realize that people who are truly different. He interpreted it differently, and could interpret several different meanings. We have also confirmed this with the regulators. Just think about it simply, this year I submitted the report I read last year. If there was no full weekly tax last year, I don't need to report this year. Everything I need to report is that I paid my weekly tax in the previous year. So this makes it easier to understand. This year, in 2022, I declared the full tax for last year, 2022. Only those above the one-tier tax need to report this year. If that were the case, I think there would be no more ambiguity. Which varieties should be included in the last year's report we made before August this year? 8. Report. Next comes the question, which I just mentioned. The term imported medicine has actually been phased out. It is precisely what all official documents now refer to as drugs produced abroad. As for drugs produced overseas, from the perspective of current regulatory practices, it must be held abroad. In this situation, as long as the medicine is produced overseas, it must be held by an offshore holder. The overseas holder must designate a domestic enterprise to issue the issuer. It has no choice, so to put it more directly, our overseas company, a foreign company, cannot submit annual reports in China. To submit an annual report, it must designate a domestic company. Moreover, this company must pay special attention to its responsibilities for the ERA. Here, it doesn't specify exactly how much responsibility for the ERA it will bear. Because the Drug Administration Law doesn't clearly state it. The Drug Administration Law only states that it must bear responsibility for the ERA. but we know that usually when referring to legal liability. Usually, there are 3 layers of responsibility. The first layer is civil liability. Civil liability means both parties sign a contract, go to court, and if you lose, at worst you pay compensation. It's all about money. The second layer is administrative responsibility. Administrative liability, of course, can also be related to money. Administrative good payments. But what really deters you most are the administrative aspects and licensing issues. For example, revoking your business license or business license. Various licenses. Then at the next level, the administration traces the person. Administrative penalties shall be imposed on the responsible persons. It even includes being blacklisted, or personally. Whether it's the company or the private message system, a list of people enters the private message system. Upload private credit, and so on. Besides administrative actions, there are even more serious criminal liabilities. Simply put, criminal liability is called imprisonment. There are no regulations here, only that we are currently waiting for the corresponding domestic agent to determine how much the negative will be. Such a regulation has yet to be established. Actually, I've been waiting for 2 years now. Let's see if there's a chance it will come out this year. Relevant regulations. But no matter what, one thing is certain here: when it comes to imported medicines, don't worry about it any further. This means designating a domestic corporate legal entity responsible for the years. So sometimes trouble arises. If it's a small breed. Moreover, domestically, he is just a commercial agency company. He actually lacks the ability to shoulder the responsibilities of the era. It is possible that there is no willingness to bear the corresponding responsibilities of the era. In this regard, I think we should consider it more thoroughly. And as mentioned earlier, the local provincial bureau is the same as our domestic agent in the province. The provincial bureau is responsible for supervising agents in preparing annual reports. Annual reports are implemented, and guidance is provided on filling out the annual reports. Currently, the annual report provides information about overseas holders and their domestic agents. Less than that. Compared to our domestic holders, the information provided is relatively limited. There are also few people to connect with. We will find that providing a domestic agent, that is a company, and the company's name and address. Then there's a contact person, a phone number, and a mobile email. However, many people may need to pay attention to this point. For companies, some agents within the company. Make sure to confirm who your contact person is. Whose phone number is left, whose phone is left. Because whenever people speak, there will always be a time to quit. What if you resign? After leaving, can you update yourself at any time? Going further, let's talk about domestic agents mentioned earlier. Domestic agents have not yet been regulated by regulations. Previously, a draft for public comment on the interim management regulations was released. They have been soliciting for so long and still haven't come out. But on the other hand, there is something related to agents. The management measures for filing medical representatives have already been issued and implemented. Therefore, the filing of the pharmaceutical representative is actually completed by the holder's domestic agent. If you consider these two, one draft for public comment and one already implemented measures, together, there should be so many things. It's basically an 8+1 responsibility system. 81. The agent further management regulations include 8 requirements in the draft for comments, 8. Including pharmaceutical representatives, there are actually 9 requirements. 9. I don't think this will change in the future, and no matter what. Establishing and implementing annual reports is the agent's responsibility. So in this regard, there should be no further controversy. The only possible controversy now is that when we fill out the system, request 1, if the drug is produced overseas, there must be an authorization letter from the overseas holder to the domestic agency. How should this authorization letter be written, and how much authority should it be written? Actually, we would think that when I discussed with many friends, how much responsibility must domestic agents bear at present? It is still unclear how many duties they will fulfill before his agent management regulations were released. For this authorization letter, or rather the power of attorney, let's start with the annual report. Other matters, including traceability and quality assurance. Other things are requested, we'll talk about that later. Since we're filling out the annual report now, let's just focus on the function of implementing the annual report. Prepare a power of attorney and authorization letter to authorize domestic agents. We'll talk about it later, maybe this will be better. Because right now, we actually can't get a draft for public comment that hasn't been released yet. As a reference, let's do a certain amount of authorization. Currently, the only way is to establish the annual report according to the requirements of the annual report. Fill it out, then accept and supervise. This is a persistent authorization. Authorized to domestic agents. Next, there's one more thing to clarify. Let me clarify again, because there are always many friends here discussing. Who will be responsible? To add another note, you can authorize the legal representative or the person in charge of the company in writing. But in our annual report template, it was a promise from the start. The above licensor promise, and this commitment is signed and stamped. It is the legal representative or the person in charge of the enterprise. Others can be authorized to sign, but the person responsible will not be someone else. And I think this template is also about regulators and the industry. In fact, there have been several interviews in the past 2 years, but this requirement has never been removed. So I think this also reflects that regulators are responsible for handling such persistence. Now, let's talk about signing and stamping documents. Some people say, isn't everything electronic now? We upload it to the system, the annual report system. It's all electronic, how am I supposed to sign? Not only that, but it could also be elsewhere when I need to sign. How do you sign when you need to get a stamp? There is currently no standard answer, but personally, I would recommend that companies organize all their information. After collection, a complete written report should be generated. On this basis, we follow the recommended annual report process. The corresponding person in charge must sign off. Perhaps besides the legal representative and the head of the company, there are even more people who need to sign. This should be kept and issued when the Provincial Bureau or other inspections come in the future. This does not affect our electronic submission, we must proceed as we should for electronic submissions. But if we're fools ourselves, I would suggest there should be a signed or stamped version. Especially when it involves multiple parties, involving external parties. For example, if it is a contract manufacturer, or if the holder and the manufacturer are separate. Or rather, multiple parties are involved. In this case, every signing step should actually be integrated. We form a written report, or a written record. Incorporate it into the annual report. Next, let's talk about it. Maybe during the discussion, some friends might have questions. So why do I have to report the drugs I export? The drugs I export are not under the jurisdiction of China's drug regulatory authorities. It's not your fault in China, and if something goes wrong, you shouldn't take responsibility. I shouldn't have reported it. But I think this view isn't quite accurate. Indeed. We export medicines to other countries, the country where the export is located. After receiving these drugs, he incorporated them into the regulations of his country. But China has always directly or indirectly borne the consequences. It's not that the drug isn't sold in China, so the Chinese drug regulatory authorities won't bear the corresponding responsibility and pressure. Strength. At the earliest, we would look at whether it was 2009 or 2011. 0911. At that time, a supervisory regulation was introduced to strengthen acceptance of processing commissions from overseas pharmaceutical manufacturers. Notice of management. This notice emphasizes the need for filing. Moreover, after the Provincial Bureau accepts the filing, it must conduct corresponding supervision. And they put forward some corresponding requirements, not wanting to entrust the contract. You can commission processing or have it done at home. Because, for example, many years ago, I saw Nigeria. There are also some other African countries whose legations have a large number of errors on their legations. They also found several batches of counterfeit medicines shipped from China, among other things. In fact, these situations will put significant pressure on China's reputation or on Chinese regulators. In this regard, although the Chinese regulator does not sell this drug in China, I still have to bear some of its consequences. Another typical example is in 2011. I remember the EU introduced a 2011-621C bill at the time, 2011-621C. If you're involved in API import and export, especially with friends who export raw materials, you're definitely very familiar with them. At that time, the EU required all EU APIs to be exported. Must be in the country where the raw materials are produced, regulators say. For example, if China produces a large portion, the Chinese Medical Products Administration must issue a statement. Declaration that raw material production complies with European GMP standards, GMP. It's a rather bizarre request. Actually, when he first released the 2011-621C, Chinese regulators strongly oppose this, because when it comes to his claims of power, there's no reason for Chinese regulators to produce raw materials that meet European GMP standards, GMP. Such a promise is equivalent to. But there's no other way. Indeed, China's raw material exports are still a major commercial issue. Or rather, besides business, there are many other considerations involved. In the end, China still had no choice but to issue documents according to European requirements. Our raw material certification documents were issued at the time. Of course, it has been aged now, but later other additions were made. In 2013, there was also a regulation on the management of pharmaceutical export sales certificates, 2013. Later, the Drug Administration introduced systems like online generators 2.0 and so on. 2.0. Now, it has been integrated into the Pharmaceutical Business Application System. But regardless, Chinese regulators must bear responsibility for exported goods. Also, we can see last month's Drug Administration Law Implementation Regulations. There is also one of these, probably over 180 pieces, 180. It's almost the end. Exported drugs must comply with the standards or contract requirements of the importing country and region. Why list this one item? Or is it the same? Even if you export and don't use or sell in China, it does not circulate in China, but Chinese regulators are passive and bear responsibility. Therefore, our joint report also requires that the exported medicines. You should also make the corresponding report in the liaison report. There is another question, and a classic one. This issue involves repackaging. Does repackaging count as commissioning? Why do you encounter so many drugs produced overseas? Because overseas drugs often have some strange regulatory forms. Imported packaging is one typical example. How do we determine the repackaging behavior of drugs produced abroad and their domestic packaging? What exactly is it? Is it a commission? Especially for domestic packaging, since we switched from an approval system to a filing system in 2020. Later, with the implementation of new drug management methods. What does it count as a status in terms of status? Including the administrative licensing and administrative management of its approval. What does it count as? It is certainly not an administrative license at first because it is filed on a filing basis. Secondly, especially for drugs produced overseas. If it is repackaged within the country, it might be their own factory. In China, in other words, Chinese factories. But it still belongs to this trans-European company. But it might not be their own factory, but a foreign factory. It really is commissioned. In this situation, does importing repackaging count as entrustment? Because our Lianbao commissions processing, and it's specifically for direction. Are we really sweet or not? Moreover, besides producing medicines overseas, our domestic pharmaceutical production also has such a demand for cross-regional repackaging. Not at my own factory, or not at my own factory at the same location. There is a possibility of packaging at other factories. How do you calculate it? To be honest, why are these questions listed here? There is no standard answer to this question. Because there are indeed many different situations, but I think one principle of planting is to keep it up. That is, we have to make sense ourselves, and at least two departments need to make sense. Besides the dormitories, our quality department, as well as our legal department. These two departments need to join in to make judgments. I think at the beginning, you probably shouldn't ask the provincial bureau about everything. If the prestige is big enough and the provincial bureau is patient, it will help you judge and evaluate whether it counts. But it's very likely that before August, if some provincial bureaus feel like hesitating because many issues remain unresolved, it may not provide a clear judgment for the company. At this point, companies often need to make their own judgments about many issues. I'm just giving an example when I repackage here, but besides repackaging, if you open the Sky System Lianbao, you'll find that many questions currently have no standard answers. And even asked regulators for answers but couldn't find out yet. Then companies really need to conduct their own assessments. Finally, based on your evaluation results, fill in the form you think is most reasonable. Anyway, I think filling out the first year like this shouldn't be a problem. No matter which method you choose, as long as you think it's the most reasonable method for yourself. In this situation where the definition is unclear, I think the first year is still okay. Okay. After reading the previous regulations, you might have questions. But when it comes to actually filling it out, it's not a question at all. When filling out the form, I think it's important to have organizational arrangements. What exactly should we do when filling out the annual report? Who should introduce us? Let's first look at the management regulations for annual reports. Initially, they require holders to establish a system and implement a system, including an annual reporting system, and ultimately, a work procedure and requirements will be formed. In fact, it often simply means one or even a set of SOPs, SOP. Or like Russian nesting dolls, big SOPs fit small SOPs, SOP. They might also incorporate some existing SOPs, SOP. But regardless, it will eventually form a system. And at what level will this system ultimately be implemented? After filling it out, the provincial bureau will go inspect. The provincial bureau might be checking more than just the result I had completed. After filling out the information on our online annual report platform, it also depends on how you fill it out. So at first, I thought I shouldn't rush to read the specific requirements of the annual report for now. Let's first see if we can establish a system. Personally, I think this system is a quality management system. It is part of a quality management system. Because ultimately, all the issues covered in the annual report. Ultimately, it's all about quality management. How should SOPs be written now, or how much should be written to what extent, SOP? Every company can make its own choices. I don't think there is a standard answer. There shouldn't even be templates, because every company has different situations. For example, some are commissioned for production, some don't. Some are like trans-European manufacturing companies, which have headquarters and branches in China. And in China, every situation is different. Using someone else's products directly is not acceptable. But it feels like at least following one basic principle. It just has to be someone. With an annual report system, will include everyone involved. These people, these functional positions within the company, for the annual report system. What is it going to do, and how is it supposed to be done? The entire process should be documented and documented. I think if you want to satisfy this fundamental principle, you should say, At least in the first year, there won't be major flaws. When the Provincial Bureau comes to inspect, we present our annual report system like this. I think it meets the most basic requirement. Who is involved? At this level, it's quite a headache. Who would be involved, and who would be involved? Right from the start, I need to talk about the 5 elders. I'll talk about that later. The 5 major persons are the enterprise heads, or the legal representatives. Then the quality manager, production manager, and pharmacovigilance manager. Quality authorizers, these people make up the so-called 5 major persons. These 5 adults might be very busy at large companies, so it's impossible for them to be personally involved or spend a lot of time there. Head. But as a system, these people must be present. And during our first year of preparation, when filling out the form, the functional departments represented by these people should all be involved. Participate in one of the filling processes of our annual report. I think this is the most basic thing. As for the various business departments, the company's internal business units, who will be involved, especially who will take the lead? That's not certain. Personally, I tend to prefer the quality department to take the lead. Because, as I said, the annual report itself should be part of the quality management system. So quality definitely has to be included. Registration is also straightforward, because a lot of information is needed to confirm and trace the source. It must be completed by the registration department. A pharmacovigilance department, if any, should have one. And this year, since China has already released the GDP. Therefore, the pharmacovigilance department should have corresponding personnel present. Besides that, when necessary, if the company's nature is to report to society, it involves a lot. Legal agreements with different stakeholders, especially within the company. If there have been many changes in the relationship between legal rights and obligations over the past year, although it is necessary to involve the legal department. In addition, the business department especially focuses on defining product attributes. Whether it's a machine medicine, etc., and some sales situation. These situations may be involved. Some annual reports contain content from government departments. That is, Tongqing's public relations department. If they are responsible for providing raw data, then these departments should be involved. Of course, it seems like a relatively large company. There will be such a division of labor. For example, when a friend of mine mentioned it, our injection department is incredibly large, especially since I was the only one doing it. And this person even half avoided it, telling me to be on guard. Because the boss said I should be on guard. And this person is still under QA management, or maybe half of them are still there, QA. A small portion can only be QA. QA. That's great, basically, this annual report is your business. No need to trouble others. Of course, what are the benefits? There are many things you can decide for yourself, you don't need to discuss it with others. Of course, the downside is that if you want to negotiate, no one will talk to you. Small companies are embarrassed, but big companies also face big company problems. In big companies, you have to discuss everything with others. Or in other words, no matter what happens, others have to discuss it with you. Because a lot of information involves different departments. We must maintain a consistent understanding from the very beginning. Of course, I'm using a larger company for this setup. Especially when preparing for the first year, there's another very important thing. It should be managed as a project. In reality, a project manager is needed. Since so many cross-departmental teams are involved. So who should come from the project management department? Actually, that's still a question. But regardless, let's first look at the red part, which I personally think needs to be introduced. The department will lead the team. Who will lead it depends on each company. Personally, I tend to lean towards the quality department. Besides whom, our entire organization also needs to prepare for what else to do. What we do is based on these 5 major people, plus these 6 or several departments. As for project management, the first step should be westernization. Each department should first assign tasks to what they do. Then some crossed paths and fought with him, so break them down a bit. Clearly define the division of responsibilities. Because some things might be like this: his original data was in the hands of Department A. But Department A doesn't need to invest a lot of information, A. He only knows a little bit. This little bit of information is what he is responsible for tracing back to the source. Then you have them fill out the annual report, but sometimes it's actually unnecessary. In this situation, it might be that although the information he possesses, but he was not the one to fill it out. He simply took this information, assuming it was accurate, hands it over to the corresponding filling department. So some optimizations may be made in the division of labor. But what I think is very important is that once you fill it out from the start, we must continuously strive for unified understanding. People often realize that language proficiency is very important, because the same sentence can be understood differently by different people. In this situation, it's not necessarily about who is right or wrong, but we must ensure that, at least as a team, we understand the same. So throughout the treated like project management. Throughout the process, many meetings are needed to, perhaps for a noun. On a single issue, we constantly strive to unify everyone's understanding. Then we did several confirmations of information, each clearly defining what they wanted to do. Then they dig into and verify their own information that should be their responsibility. Then confirm. Only after confirmation will you check which department should fill it out. If you're worried, if you're not at ease, should you leave it to uni president? Or this person bears too much responsibility, and if they debut, it's all over. Or maybe just let the Lianbao platform be open anyway. Can multiple authorized alternate accounts be allowed to enter? Except for company phone numbers, multiple people can be authorized to enter. So does that mean everyone just fills in their own part? There is no right or wrong way to fill it out. It depends on the company's size and your own arrangements. So how to fill it out also needs to be determined. Finally, after I submit, how do I archive it? How can you keep the relevant records and files? Because once an inspection is needed, it is not just about reading the joint report. He must have brought those Lianbao and corresponding evidence. He must present the corresponding records, the corresponding SOPs, SOP, my entire Lianbao system, and so on. I should prepare as much as I want, and once it's time to check, I can provide it. This shows what needs to be done. In terms of how to do it, I think the most fundamental thing is, you should understand it from the start, just like I said earlier. Those 5 people, the legal representative, the company head, production quality authorizer, production manager, quality authorizer, not necessarily available. These corresponding necessary authorizations, especially across companies. When I am entrusted with entrustment, I probably need to confirm the corresponding authorization. Then, a relatively stable working group with all relevant parties involved should be formed. According to the project plan, it's best to have a project manager. Develop a project plan and proceed according to it. Actually, time is running out now. It looks like it's the end of August. But isn't it June now? In fact, it will be done quickly, especially for foreign companies. One thing to note, colleagues abroad are about to start summer vacation. During summer vacation, it's hard to find anyone, so a lot of information needs to be verified. You have to check now. If you wait a few days, you might not be able to find him. Although it looks like it's late August, there are actually only a few days left. Once things are clarified, the main thing is project management. If the project manager is in charge, that's very good. To establish work procedures, drive motivation, and finally, after the data is out, it is essential to have a compliant process to reduce errors in filling out the form. I feel the whole process should be like this. At first, especially about what these people do and how they do. Once you confirm it, it's very important, and I think it helps everyone work more efficiently. It means advancing according to project management methods, first reaching a project manager. The authorized project manager then sets the goals we want to achieve. Then we keep making adjustments during the process. Because many problems are difficult for people to encounter at first, there must be a mechanism for continuous exploration and adjustment, especially in the first year. I believe things might go smoothly the next year, but you need to be aware that the next year may also have regulatory requirements. I think when we filled out the first year, the provincial bureaus are quite tolerant, as long as you don't cheat or falsify information. Ordinary ones are a bit confused, or make small, basic mistakes. Maybe it can still be forgiven, but by the second year, things might be different. The requirements from regulators in the second year are definitely higher than in the first year. As mentioned earlier, as an organizational structure, these 5 major figures are needed. Actually, I treat the legal representative and the company head as one. People watch, because they actually represent the top leader. Besides this, the production license also states only the person in charge, only the authorized person, and the production manager. Look at the production license version. Some older versions don't have that kind of authority. In addition, because China implemented pharmacovigilance last year, there must also be a person in charge of pharmacovigilance. Everyone is fully assembled. This is the high-level organizational structure that the Federation should have. The proper project management we just mentioned is now seen in the Pink Society. I think what's more important is that, throughout the entire process, from the very beginning, there is a dedicated project manager and a competent project manager to drive things forward. It would be fantastic. In this regard, if there is no such thing, or if the project manager is not moving forward effectively, it can be very troublesome, especially when the research report is only a few days old. It looks like there are still 2 months left, but there are only a few days left. Another important point, we shouldn't just shut the door and mess around by ourselves. Because, as mentioned earlier, when the Federation emerged, especially in its first year, there are too many things we're not sure about. Some issues are hard to understand. Or even if I understand the question, I don't know how to answer. The left side is inappropriate, and the right side is also inappropriate. In this situation, I personally think everyone should try to follow their peers. Different companies, or perhaps we are all in the same province. Several large companies, or rather, if all belong to foreign enterprises, everyone is facing similar situations. Let's discuss together. Or rather, they all belong to holders of B transfer, which is a contract manufacturer, B. If you don't produce yourself, there are some questions you should fill in. Let's all discuss together. In this case, I think if many people discuss together, will form a shared understanding, and the likelihood of their success, or the correct possibility, it should be even higher. Or on the other hand, it's about to be wrong, or everyone is wrong together. And you're not alone. So at this point, it feels like, if it's not a company business secret, you should share it with everyone more. Try to reach some consensus, and when filling out the joint report, communicate more with industry peers. Okay, what I just mentioned is actually preparation, okay? Then, when filling out the details, you might encounter some other issues. Once you get started, you'll encounter something. Binding. Holder binding. It sounds simple. Once our data enters the platform, all of this is existing data. When I enter the holder, if you pull it out, won't you bring it all out? It's as if the person holding it is this little person holding a stick. On this rod is a candied hawthorn stick.